Just real briefly, some of you may not know me very well. I'm just some guy that draws stuff and sometimes posts them on the Discord server here, and people seem to like them. And I offered to run this seminar to sort of talk about how I go about drawing maps, try to demystify some of it. And there was a lot more interest than I expected there would be. I do not have any sort of artistic training. I'm not a teacher, but I'm going to do my best to talk about how I approach drawing maps, some of the techniques I use, and hopefully that will sort of demystify it and make it seem more approachable. I know a few times I've encouraged people to draw things and share them on the server, and a few people said they were intimidated, and I really hope that isn't the case, because I only really started drawing a lot maybe 3 or 4 years ago for maps, and then for a long time I didn't do any other kinds of drawing because I was like, well, that's for real artists to do. So I didn't do anything except maps because, as I'll get to, like maps, you're just doing 3 or 4 different symbols over and over again. So there's really just a limited number of techniques that you need. But then I only really started doing other types of drawing maybe a year ago, year and a half, if that. So I guess what I was getting at is if I can draw stuff and it looks kind of neat and people like it, there's a very, very good chance that you can too. So I would encourage you to give it a try. Let's see. Tools. If you're just following along with this workshop, seminar, pretty much just any kind of paper and anything that you would write with is fine. If you want to do a lot of drawing of maps or other sorts of like I guess art, I would recommend getting some fine liners or markers. They are a lot easier to work with than like your normal ballpoint pen. The ink's a little thinner. It goes on easier. You don't have to use as much pressure as when you're drawing with a ballpoint where the ink's really thick. It dries quickly, so you're not as likely to smudge it, and the ink doesn't soak through the paper the way a lot of ballpoints do. So I've used a few different kinds, and I can share some links to those in Discord. But lately I've been using these Pigma Micron pens. You can pick these up at like Target or Amazon, pretty much anywhere. They come in a number of sizes, which is nice for being able to do detail work while still having the larger pens for fills and shading. But a lot of the maps that I've done, I did with just a single size pen. So you don't really need like a lot of them. Like this was all done with one of these fine liners, all just one pen. Same with this enormous one that took about 6 weeks, doing like 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And it's all just one size pen. And you can see like in the forest, I probably would have gotten better results if I were using a smaller pen, but I was just using what I had on hand. And if you just have like a ballpoint or something, use it. You'll get pretty good results still. It's just with these fine liners, it is a lot easier, and it's kind of satisfying to just do a smooth, easy line and have it just be as dark as you want and not have to go over it multiple times like you would with a ballpoint. So if you're feeling a little stuck, changing pens and equipment's a good way to kind of motivate yourself to draw more. For paper, just regular copy paper or office papers, perfectly fine. That's what I do most of my work on. I do have like a drawing pad with nicer drawing paper that I use sometimes, but most of it's just letter size, or I have like a bunch of legal size paper that I have no practical use for, so I cut it in half. So if you see like this paper's kind of oddly sized, that's why. It's actually a pretty good size for doing sort of medium maps. The other thing I like doing as practice, and I think I'll talk about this a bit later, is just doodling, just filling the paper, not trying to make one single cohesive map, but just, trying a different way of making mountains and doing a few of those and trying a different one, or seeing how one style of mountain and forest work together, and just fill up pages of that stuff, because it's practice. You'll develop your own style, and you'll try a lot of different techniques and then figure out what works for you. So you don't have to have like an end goal of, I'm going to make this map and here's what all the regions are going to be, and I'm really focused on the end result. It's sort of exploratory, and it's practice. And I recommend doing a lot of that. I try to do some doodles, not necessarily maps, but just anything at least once a day, just because it's fun. Any questions about anything I've talked about so far? All right, cool. I will continue on, and pretty soon we'll start drawing. But first up, I want to talk a little bit about what's the point of a map, which seems like kind of a silly question. I mean, a map is mostly it tells you where things are in relation to each other. If you put a hex grid over it, maybe you're using it for a hex crawl, and it'll tell you what kind of terrain is in each of the little hexes and all that. And that's part of it. There's the very utilitarian definition of what a map is. But it's also, particularly if you're sharing it with your players, but also just for your own use, it sets a mood. Like, it kind of contributes to the mood, the tone of a game, like the style of the map. And I'm talking about, like, this is also the case for like fantasy novels. So if you open up the Lord of the Rings and pull out that awesome Tolkien map, like that kind of brings you into the world just looking at it, right? Like you get this like feeling of wonder seeing, here's like these mountain ranges and the forest, and like just seeing it all laid out there, and the way that it's drawn contributes to that. So there's the practical uses of maps, but they're also great just for kind of getting you into that headspace of, this is the world that we're playing in. And it also works as, like as a prop, basically, for showing to your players to convey to them, this is what the world's like, beyond just, here's where the towns are, here's this mountain range. And I'll talk a little bit about that some more when we get to, photographing your maps, or just being able to get like a digital version of it, because there's some things you can do with how you photograph the map that can also contribute to tone in interesting ways. But that's enough talking. Let's go ahead and get started with drawing. If you ever take any sort of art class or any sort of drawing class, they will always start off with the importance of being able to draw straight, smooth, confident lines, and drawing from the shoulder and not moving your wrists and fingers a lot. And I'm not going to say that that's bad advice or that it's not important, but it is probably less important for maps. So a lot of what you might end up doing when you're drawing a map, because you're working with fairly small scale and there aren't a lot of straight lines in nature. So a lot of the technique for like doing really good art drawing is less important here. So if your lines are a little wavy, your mountains aren't perfect triangles, well, mountains aren't perfect triangles. So like any of the little mistakes you make, they're just contributing to the character of the map, I think. But there's a few basic shapes that you'll need And I'll start with mountains because I think they do the most to contribute to the character of a map. They're kind of, to me anyway, like the most striking thing. You're going to notice the mountains and the shape of them probably before anything else. And it really comes down to, I'm going to draw a little bigger than I normally would. Hopefully it picks up. If my screen looks small to you, if you click on it in Discord, it'll make it bigger. So hopefully you can see this well. But mountains, you're really just going to start with a triangle. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It's better if it's not. So, you might have, more of a wobbly shape, and that's great. And you're going to draw a lot of those kind of overlapping. So it helps to draw from the bottom of your page up if you're going to do those sort of overlaps, because, it would be hard for me if once this, I'll skip ahead a bit, but it would be hard for me to put a mountain in front of this one without trying to fit it into drawings I've already done. So when basically any of these features, when you're drawing, you'll want to work front to back, and that means bottom to top. But for mountains, just beyond the basic shape, you can actually get pretty far just doing these triangles. But the thing that's going to make them read as mountains when someone looks at them is shading, to give it a bit of shape to it. And to do that, you want to establish a direction of light. So I almost always have light coming from the right side, and then I shade in the left. You can do it the other way, just be consistent. So if you are shading the left side of things on your map, do that consistently and don't switch back and forth. It will make things look like a jumble. So we have light coming from the right, and just to make things a little bit faster, I'm going to shift to a bigger pen. You'll see I just drew like kind of a wavy line down and connected it. And I'm just going to shade in this section. And the nice thing about working in just black and white is it doesn't really matter too much if you stay inside the lines, because who can tell? Ideally, the lines won't be very visible afterwards. And this is just one style that I'm showing you. I'll get to a couple of others, but this is the style I typically do. If you've seen any of my maps, this will look very familiar. So you shade in like half of it, and that helps, right? Like you can kind of see, okay, there's a bit of shape to it, and there's a lit side and a dark side. And then to give it a little more texture, what I usually do is I will do like these little lines coming out, and they're not all the same size. I try to make it so they're not, evenly spaced, something like that. And then come in from the other side and do a few more. And again, this is bigger than I would normally draw them, so it might look a little off. But that's the basic idea to do to one of the mountains. Now, the next step would be, I'll just do this. Do a few more. And I'm just going to do the shading real quick so I can show you how to do the overlap. And yeah, I'll do it this way. So one thing that you'll run into is if these are overlapping, you can just run the line right up to the next mountain. What I found is if you leave just a tiny bit of gap, so there's that white space, it will make the mountains pop a little more. They will stand out a bit more while still looking like they are sort of overlapping each other. So you can see I have a little bit of gap there. It's not perfect, but that's okay. And up here, I'll do kind of the same thing. So I'm going to switch to a different pen. And these are much faster to draw when they're smaller and you don't have all that space to fill in. But again, just doing this quickly to get the idea across. Here we go. And you can see like this mountain is behind this one, and there's a little bit of white space there, which looks kind of weird when you look at it really closely, but if you have a lot of mountains, I think it reads better. Let me find a good example. Or if not a good example, at least an example. So you can see on this map, like this mountain in particular has a bit of space around it there as well. And if you just lay it down, I think it does a pretty good job of showing depth. Whereas if you run the lines into each other, they kind of blur, particularly if you have a dark area running into another dark area. So any questions about that basic mountain technique before I continue on? All right, so there are a lot of different ways of doing mountains, but most of them kind of have that same principle where you're going to start with a triangle and you're going to shade in some portion of it. So if you want to do the more sort of Tolkien-ish, you know, there's he does some things with, excuse me, like rolling hills as well. And instead of doing this sort of like lines or hash marks on the side, just shade in. And it can be a little uneven. And it kind of takes a bit of a judgment call, particularly when you have like these more complex mountain shapes. Like you can see I have, you know, 3 areas of shadow because I drew it with like sort of 3 peaks of different sizes. And you're just kind of unevenly just moving your pen back and forth, not trying to make like a smooth area. And, you know, that I think reads pretty well as a mountain. And you can do the same thing with, you know, layering like these little ranges of mountains. And just deciding where the base is, because what you'll want to do is have the shadow on the far side from the light and more towards the bottom as well, because that's where the shade would lie, right? So that's the more sort of like a Tolkien style mountains. You can also, if you want a lighter appearance, not so much dark, you can do, and I'll just do one of these to show, you can do, instead of solid blocks, you can just do lines as an option as well. I've done a few maps that way. But again, it just comes down to rough triangular shape and shading in about half of it. The other style of mountain, which I don't use as often, and I think it can look neat. My problem is I don't know when to stop. Is you can do, again, rough triangle and do ridge lines, coming down from the peak. And again, like my problem here is I don't know when to stop adding these. So it doesn't always come across as a mountain when I'm done. And I think these work better when there's kind of lots of them. Getting the shape or expressing like the kind of the 3D shape of the mountain, I think is a little harder this way than with shading, which is part of why I don't do it as much. Although a thing you can do with it, if you want to do like snow caps, there are markers that you can get that are like shading markers that are gray. For these, I just used a pencil and just like the edge of the pencil and just and again a little sloppy, but it's a pencil, so you can always erase it if you need to, and then sort of smudge it a bit. And if you need an eraser recommendation, I do like these sort of white plastic high polymer ones. Statler also makes them. I like them much more than the pink rubber ones. I think they don't make as much of a mess, and you can erase well without just ripping into the paper. So highly recommend it. These are really cheap at like Target or Walmart or wherever, and they last quite a while. But yeah, you can do that sort of, like snow peaks and shade, and it's just mixing ink and pencil, or you can have other kinds of marker for doing that sort of shading. Okay, so that's mountains. The next thing I want to cover is related to that. That's hills, and you have a few options for doing that. For doing hills, just like you do anything else. The easy one, because you already know how to do a mountain, is just do small mountains like that. There's a little hill off by itself. Just takes a second. What I usually end up doing, so I'm kind of partial to my big blobby, cartoony, ridiculous mountains. And so I tend to do sort of more kind of cartoony and goofy hills to go with those. Let's see. Yeah, there's some examples here. Thank you. A thing I'll point out just very quickly on this map, one of the things when you're getting into doing like the composition for a larger map is how tightly packed you want to make mountains. So for example, on this map, those mountain chains are very dense, but they don't have to be. You can do bigger, more widely spread mountains. Just as a choice. It kind of depends on how dark do you want the paper to be. Like, yeah, just pointing that out, because on this one I ended up doing the mountains very loose, and there's lots of space between them. And that's just a choice you can make. But you can see the way I typically do hills to go with that style is just like a little rough semicircle. These are a little more elongated than I often do, and just a little bit of shading on one side. I just do a few lines for that. So over here I'll do just a couple, and you can do the same sort of overlapping. And then, so the thing I'm kind of struggling with doing this workshop is I usually have my head a lot closer to the paper so I can see a little better, but I don't want to like lean down and get in the way of the camera or anything, actually. And I dropped my pen. But I'll do a few more of those. And this is another place where if you have multiple size pins, you might want to do a thicker one for the shape of the hill, and then a finer point pin for the shade marks. And again, that's just establishing that it is a round shape and the light is coming from the upper right. So mountains and hills, they tend to go hand in hand. So you might, have a hill coming, from behind the mountain. So again, you can do a little bit of that layering. Or, like I said, you can do basically tiny little miniature mountains with the same sort of rough shape and shading that you use for the bigger ones. All right. Ready to move on from mountains and hills? Cool. The next major kind of terrain that you're going to see in this sort of fantasy map would be forests. And these are kind of both easy and hard. It's easy because if you just want to do the sort of Tolkien-ish individual trees method, it's really just circles or even semicircles. But they're very tiny. They take a lot of time. So some people will do sort of bigger, blobbier forests, which I'm terrible at. I have a hard time making them read as trees when I try to do it. But just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So like the Tolkien type ones, really just small overlapping circles. And the ones in front would have trunks. And then, behind you'll have more. And if you look at like the maps from the Lord of the Rings, you can definitely see like rows of trees where he's doing this, where he's just going one after another. And it's kind of neat and orderly, but there'll be a few spots where there's a gap that gets filled in. So like there's dark spots in the forest. And particularly if you are drawing these very, very small, like I usually do, it's easy to go a little cross-eyed and have to like look away for a few minutes. This is one of the more tedious parts of map drawing. So my recommendation is to do a few at a time and then come back to it later. Drawing maps for me is really, it's a thing I do to relax. So if you're ever drawing and it starts getting like stressful or tedious and you want to take a break, take a break. That's supposed to be fun. Yeah, so like that's one way to do it. Or here's an example. You can space the trees out a bit so you can see more of the trunks. Have a bit of space between them, but you're still essentially drawing individual trees. And you can also do. Oh yeah, that's a good point. This is another thing that's going to help the whole map sort of cohere. You have shading already on the left side of the mountain, so if you do just a tiny little shadow on the trunks, that will help as well with the composition, like establishing where the light's coming from. So the shape there is just circle, tiny little straight line, and then a little hook on the end. So when I say you don't need to know how to draw a lot of shapes, I'm completely serious. We have a triangle, a circle, and a line so far. So there is not a whole lot of like technique needed to draw these sorts of mountains. It's just a few simple things and then practicing it and just getting used to it, having that muscle memory for things like shading. You can maybe get a little stressed out about, but like when I did that shading, remember I was just moving my pen sort of erratically, so it's not like there's rhyme or reason to how I'm doing it either. And if you have a larger pen for doing the shading, that helps, but not necessary. If all you have is a pencil, that works too. It'll just look a little different. So, and hopefully I'm sort of demystifying this and breaking it down and making it seem more approachable, because it should be. Drawing's fun. So yeah, the other type of forest, I'm going to embarrass myself now because I'm bad at it, but it's kind of drawing sort of a blobby shape. And what I'm doing is I'm just like shaking my fingers a bit as I'm drawing the line, the thing you're not supposed to do, and going over the same places a couple times. And by itself, that's not going to read as a mountain. So you do, or as a forest. So you do a few trunks on one side of it. And there are better examples of this out on the internet, YouTube, people showing how to do this. Because when I do it, it always just looks like a flat, rough disc sitting on some sticks, which is not what it should look like. So this is an area where I could use some more practice. And then to like give some texture in the middle, just little lines. Try not to make a face by mistake, because that's easy to do. Or do make a face and just lean into it. And this is skull face forest. Nothing wrong with that. Like I said, I have a harder time doing this easy blobby type forest than the I'm going to draw every individual tree kind. Even though this is much faster, I almost always do this style instead. But that's just me. Besides circles, of course, triangles. If you want a pine tree. If you want a palm tree, I can't help you. So forest, hills, mountains, that's going to cover a lot of the kinds of terrain that you'll want on a typical fantasy map. Next thing I'm going to talk about is shorelines and rivers, and I'll just start a new sheet for that. So just to sort of preview this, when I'm starting a new map, what I'll typically do is just a rough sketch of where I want different things. So I'll say like there'll be a mountain range here. That's going to be a forest. There'll be a few hills here, and this is ocean over there. And I'm not going to trace any of that, but that just, reminds me when I come back to this later what I had in mind when I was composing it. So I have this shoreline here, and shores meander, right? And I might go over it a second time, and I'm not going to do it perfectly. And that means the line's going to have different widths as you're going along it, which is bad in certain contexts, but I think, it gives a little more interest to the line. And then the next thing I do, and if I'm using multiple weights of pin, I will sometimes switch to a smaller one, but you don't have to, is I'll do just short lines that kind of follow the general direction of the shoreline. And that's, I guess it's supposed to be like breakers, like breaking waves on the ocean, but I don't know. I've seen the ocean in person once in my life, so I'm far from an expert at such things. But that's how I typically do coastlines. If you look at like Tolkien's maps, what he will do is have a sort of a heavy line for the coast, and then several smaller solid lines. And you can even go smaller on the pins, and he'll do that for coastlines and larger rivers and lakes. He will have multiple lines like that, but I typically just keep it simpler, do one thick line for the coast and smaller lines, and I usually try to vary the length a bit. And if there's a why not? We'll say, there's an island out here. I'll do the same thing. I'll go over it again to try to give the line a little more character. And same thing with the breakers. Now, this probably isn't accurate to how breakers actually work, but we're fantasy cartographers, not oceanographers, so it's fine. The whole point here isn't to do an accurate drawing like you're doing like you're a landscape artist. It's what is the simple, abstracted, symbolic version of the thing that I can draw easily, and when someone looks at it, it's going to read as that's a coastline, that's a mountain, those are forests. It doesn't have to look like a satellite photograph. So that's how I would do coastlines. For rivers, and they look best in context with more terrain around, but I will. So usually what I'll do is just meandering line. Like that. For the geography, rivers are, for the most part, going to start in mountains or hilly regions and go down towards the sea. You'll have tributaries sort of joining them. You'll have like a delta type region, and that's what I usually do, is just a simple solid line like that. The other technique, and it takes a bit of planning when you're doing your shoreline, is to do two lines kind of roughly parallel. And you need to plan that if that's what you want to do when you do your shoreline, because you don't want to have it run directly into the shoreline and butt up against it the way I did here. You want it to actually open up. And then, if you're doing the sort of Tolkien style, and I'm dragging my hand there. I meant for that to be a smooth line, but it's fine. Just don't look at it too closely. But yeah, that's just a river down into the sea. It takes a little more work, a little more planning versus just the solid line. and I'm lazy, so I typically just do the solid line. But practice them both. Maybe you'll decide you like one more than the other. So that's rivers, that's shorelines. The other kind of body of water you'll typically see are lakes. And again, I usually do a fairly simple thing here. I'll do just a rough shape. And typically there'll be a river outlet. And then I will do a smaller one inside. And give that just a second, and I'll erase the M. Again, this is why fine liners are nice. They dry quickly, so you don't have to worry so much about smudging them. And that's the easy style. I do that most often. So there's a lake. I have some smaller ones, and you can see they're sort of behind the mountains. So I'll break up the line to make that show a little better. That's my usual go-to. You can also do broken lines, sort of like you do breakers along the coastline. I think that also works pretty well and is easy. And then if you want to get a little fancier, very thick rivers and some more complex shading around the outside, some hatching, and I can show you how I do that. I'm not sure it's always worth the effort, but it's worth knowing. So I will just do a simple shape for a lake, and I want the edges to be very dark. So I'll go over that again. And this is where having multiple size pins would help. If you just have one size, this is going to be a little tougher for you to do. But what you're doing is just going to be short, straight lines coming out from the side. So I'll start here. And I'm just doing lines coming out. And I'll do the other side as well. Okay, and up here. And that's a start. And then the idea is you just basically keep doing that, but make the lines a little shorter. So you can still do it pretty quickly. And you might have a few longer lines, but they're all going the same direction, but having different lengths. So some of them stick out more than others, and you get a bit of texture to it. I'll do the same thing over here. And this is when you're doing hatching, this is where I don't recommend trying to do it from the shoulder because they're pretty short lines, but this is where being able to do quick, confident, straight lines helps, but they don't need to be very long, so it's not that hard. Even so, like a lot of times when I'm hatching, like the end will curve a bit, and it's fine. And then in the middle of the lake, you can do just a few sort of straightish lines. And yeah, that's another way to do a lake. And you can shade around the edges a bit more. A little more work, maybe worth it, but I almost always do the simpler kind. All right, any questions about water features or anything else that we've talked about so far? Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, glad you're enjoying it. So that's going to cover most of the natural features that you would use. So we've done mountains, hills, forests, water. The only other thing I can think of that you might want, and there are probably lots of other ways to do it, are like swamps or wetlands. And the way I typically do that, I'll do it up here just to, and larger than I normally would to show you, is just, so what I did was one line mostly straight up, and then starting from the same base, just two lines curving out. And if you do a bunch of those together, it'll look kind of like reeds or like some kind of swamp grass. So, a lot of my maps I'll have, like clusters of that around like river deltas or anywhere where a few rivers come together and it seems like it might be kind of a swampy area. And, there might be some other ways to portray that, but that's my usual go-to. The reason why you might not want to do that is if you want to, I don't typically draw anything for like grasslands, right? So like this is kind of an empty area up here. If you do want to do grasslands, you might end up doing something like that, just a few lines together. And if you do that, then it can be, you want to make sure that that looks different from what you're using for your swamps, right? So like the styles are distinct, so you can look at it and be like, oh, here's the rolling grasslands, and then there's the dismal swamp. The last sort of feature I'm going to talk about, or set of features, would be more of the man-made stuff, towns, roads, bridges. And those take a little bit of planning up front because you need to know how they're going to interact with the natural features. And particularly that matters for rivers. So here's a map I started yesterday. If you were in any of the video chats I was in, you might have seen me sort of working on it. And you can see, as I mentioned, I blocked out, like here's going to be the mountains, some hills here, forest there and there. And I did the coastline already. And I did the rivers. But when I did the rivers, what I did was I left gaps in them where I thought I might want to put bridges. You don't have to do that, of course, but I find it easier to just leave the gap, and that gives me an idea of where I'm going to place the road. And then the bridges, when you do that, so you start drawing your river, leave a gap. Here's the other half of the river, right? It's really just two semicircles or slightly curved lines even. And that's the bridge over it. For roads, just small, evenly spaced dots. And they tend to be a bit straighter than rivers. But if you've ever been to New England, roads aren't always straight. They tend to meander a lot. If you've ever tried driving in like Boston or basically anywhere in Massachusetts that's been around for a few hundred years, roads will wander and meander a bit. But yeah, I'll typically just do dotted lines like that. Now, if you want to do like major roads and smaller trails, that probably means you would want to use this style of river with the two lines sort of between them. And then your major roads would be like a solid line. And we can do a bridge there. If I'm getting like too much of a mess on one sheet so you can't tell what I'm talking about, just let me know. But like here would be like a river bridge that's kind of sloppy. And then I would use the solid lines for major roads. And then you can still have like, here's a little game trail that connects up to the road before it goes off into the forest or whatever. So Uh, it's kind of a thing you would want to plan up front if I'm going to have multiple types of paths that I need to distinguish between. That means I need to draw rivers in this other style rather than having them also be solid lines. If you have colored pens, you can do it that way as well. Like roads are red, rivers are black, or however you want to do it. But just try to make sure that whatever symbol or technique you use for one feature doesn't interfere with its use for a different type of feature. And then for towns, what I usually do, again, because it's easy, is I'll just draw like a little box. Or sometimes if it's important to know, like, here's one set of villages that are like politically connected with each other, and here's this other country over here. I'll do like some of them are white boxes, some of them are black filled in boxes, or I might have circles. I did a map recently that's in the art channel, and I'll pull that up later maybe, where I had all four. So like it was a bunch of different islands, and like this set of islands over here, it was white boxes for the towns and villages. This set had black boxes, black circles, white circles, and that's the easy way. The other thing you can do, and I don't do it often because it's a little harder to do, particularly if you only have one size of pen, is draw like little houses. And that's just a square with a triangle on top. Fill in the triangle and do just a tiny amount of shadow on the bottom. You know, and these are pretty small settlements, so it's just one or two houses on each. Oh, that looks great. MG Richards just had to drop, but he posted a picture for show and tell in the thread, which looks good. So yeah, you can draw little houses, or you can get a little more elaborate and draw little like castle things, which is again easier to do if you have multiple size pens, because it can get a little fine. So like I have a little walled city here with like towers in it, a little tower off by itself down here, a house. It kind of depends on just how much detail do you want to get into when you're drawing these. And if you just, you know, idly drawing a map and you're having fun doing that much detail, do it. Otherwise, perfectly serviceable. If you have good handwriting, which I don't, you might want to do like the lettering at this point and write like the names of the towns. I usually don't, because my handwriting's terrible, and I find it easier if I need that to when I take a picture of the map, I will save it and then edit it and put the labels in at that point, because you have options for like what kind of fonts and styling you want to use, and you can make it look really nice. But if you do any sort of calligraphy, or if you have nice handwriting, you can do the labels at this point, or you can even instead of doing any sort of symbol for towns, I think the Tolkien maps do this, just write the name of the town instead of drawing it. So like instead of having a box here, just write, this is Bywater. I think that's covering all of the different techniques, and we have about 15-20 minutes left, I think. So I don't want to keep talking too much. Anything about any of those techniques or anything that we've covered so far that I need to talk more about, or if you have questions or comments about? Yeah, Lou. Yeah. Deserts. I haven't done a lot of snow. What I do for deserts, thanks for asking, uh, is I will do these sort of like little like sand dune shapes, and they're pretty similar to hills, except for I will trail one side of them and shade it a little bit, and then I will just do little dots and lines, and I'll do an example of that. We'll go ahead and say there's uh, some desert over on this side of these mountains. So, I'll draw a few dunes, shade them in just a little bit. And again, you want more of the shade towards the bottom and the dark edge. And what I'm doing is just I'm moving in a line, but I'm lifting and dropping the pen as I'm doing it unevenly. And this is actually a good technique. You would do a bit more contact with the paper, but if you're doing like a dungeon map and you want to do like that sort of like broken tile look, you would do this same thing along the graph paper lines to do that. And it's just, lifting and dropping the pens, and you can vary the density of it, and you don't want everything to be on the line, so you can go back in and draw a few dots in between. But that's my usual technique, and that's kind of like sand and broken rock and dunes and things like that. And that's actually a pretty good segue to get into like, I'm not a geographer by any means, but like some basic ideas for like how you want to set up a composition, and like how the different terrain features sort of relate to each other. I already mentioned like usually rivers will have their source in mountains or hilly regions and flow downwards. Deserts are often in what's called a rain shadow. So I have this mountain range here, and I figure the weather's coming in, like any sort of precipitation's coming in this direction. And if the mountain range is tall, that means it's going to be drier over here. So just playing ahead, I'd say, okay, so I will have desert over here. And if I have any sort of swamps or wetlands, they would be over on this side, in the like forests here. If I had the forest extending over towards the mountains when the elevation gets higher, that might be where I have my like pine trees, things of that nature. So just, thinking ahead about how you want the different, what sort of different regions you want on the map and how they relate to each other. But yeah, deserts typically on the far side of a mountain from an ocean. I don't have any sort of special technique for doing snowy regions, though. All right, cool. I think that mostly covers like all of the actual drawing stuff, unless anybody has any questions about, composing different things. I talked a bit about drawing bottom to top, which lets you do front to back. So you can have, mountains in the front you're drawing first and then filling in behind them, moving up the page. And yeah, the only other thing I'd say is try to draw a little bit every day. And if it starts getting tedious or boring, take a break, come back to it later. The process of making the map should be enjoyable, and then at the end you have this neat thing that you can look at, you can take a picture, you can share it with others. And I don't know, I think that's really cool to be able to do that. Yeah. I This will be a little bit harder for me to show because I am using my phone's camera as the document camera here. But I will use my phone camera for it, and getting the lighting, like you can see, I'm like casting shadows all over this, and having like the phone in a place where there's not shadow everywhere and getting the lights right is tough. But the other thing you can do is kind of just hold the paper up and take a picture of it. And you don't have to get it perfectly squared on typically. And just using your phone camera, those are usually pretty good. And then the editing that you can do on the phone, that's most of what I do. So I'll set it to do like auto levels. And there's usually like an exposure control, and I will turn the exposure up a bit. On an iPhone, it's like 25% is usually pretty good. And what that does is any of the little, like, I mean, you should erase the pencil after you draw anyway, but like any like little like smudges or bits of like eraser that are left on the paper, that will help minimize them. So you can turn up the exposure a bit for black and white, boost the contrast a bit, and then like check out the different filters and see if any of them evoke the kind of mood that you want. So recently I've been doing the like more of the black and white style filters that have really high contrast and will have a really white and really black blacks. But I've also done on iOS like the dramatic warm filter will give it more of a sepia tone, like a little kind of like brown and warm. And I think there's a couple pictures I think on the forum thread that show that. And it comes down to the kind of mood that you're trying to get. Another thing you can do, I'm not sure if I can easily show this off. Let's see. Grab one of these lights. If you just put the paper, yeah, that's not going to show up at all. But if you put the paper in front of a light and then take a picture of it, and I don't think I can do this without, that's not bad. I would have the camera back a little bit more, but that gives the texture of the paper, and it can be an interesting effect. And you don't have to do it in like Photoshop or anything. That's just literally holding paper in front of a light and then snapping a picture of it. Other things you can do, instead of just having the picture be square on like this, I'm actually going to switch so I don't give anybody motion sickness as I'm doing this. The other thing you can do that is kind of a neat effect is come in at a low angle. And it has that sort of depth of field effect where things farther away and up close to the camera are sort of out of focus. And I'm sorry about the shaking. I'm just holding this in my hand. And it gives it almost like a 3D sort of effect. And that can be neat for like you do a larger region map. And then do this for like a detail, like a smaller area of the map that you're going to use for a particular session. That can be kind of a neat effect for that. So I guess like my answer there for like photography is just like with drawing, just play with it a bit. Find out neat things you can do that make it look interesting. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.